She is the undisputed, rhinestone-studded queen of American culture. With her towering blonde wigs, her glittering costumes, and her unmistakable infectious laugh, she built a multi-billion-dollar empire by making the entire world smile. She is the ultimate symbol of joy, generosity, and unapologetic authenticity. But behind the blinding neon lights of Dollywood and the meticulously crafted, larger-than-life persona lies a reality that breaks the heart in ways no country ballad ever could. At 80 years old, Dolly Parton is a woman who wears a highly engineered suit of armor to protect a deeply bruised, incredibly tender soul. Behind the global adoration stand a woman who survived mind-numbing, freezing poverty, only to conquer the ruthless music industry by refusing to surrender her soul to powerful men. A fiercely devoted wife who maintained a staggering 60-year marriage by hiding her husband entirely from the public eye. And most devastatingly, a woman who harbored a desperate, lifelong dream of becoming a mother, only to have a universe cruelly strip that possibility away, plunging her into a period of darkness so profound she nearly didn't survive it. How does the brightest light in the entertainment industry navigate the agonizing, silent grief of an empty cradle? Why does she hide behind the massive wigs and the heavy makeup? And what is the breathtaking cost of transforming your own private heartbreak into a motherly love that eventually saved hundreds of millions of children? Before we answer these questions, we must go back to the beginning. To understand the saint at 80, you must first know the barefoot, hungry girl in the Smoky Mountains. The dirt floor, the painted lady in the armor of rhinestones. There's a romanticized, deeply comfortable myth in American culture regarding rural poverty. We like to imagine that growing up in a rustic log cabin in the mountains builds strong character, filled with simple, wholesome family values and cheerful folk songs. We sanitize the past because the actual, unvarnished reality of extreme poverty is simply too painful to look at. But true, grinding poverty is not romantic. It is terrifying. It is a suffocating, daily emergency that leaves permanent, invisible scars on the architecture of a child's soul. Dolly Rebecca Parton was born on January 19, 1946, in a tiny, dilapidated one-room cabin in Locust Ridge, Tennessee, deep in the isolated heart of the Great Smoky Mountains. She was the fourth of 12 children. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, was a sharecropper and a construction worker. He was a fiercely proud, hard-working man, but he was also completely illiterate. He could neither read nor write his own name. He worked brutally long days in the tobacco fields, returning home with his hands callous and bleeding, carrying the agonizing, silent shame of a father who knows that his absolute best efforts will never be enough to properly feed his children. Her mother, Avi Lee, was a woman of quiet, staggering endurance. By the time she was 35 years old, she had given birth to 12 children. When there was absolutely no food left in the cupboards, Avi Lee would sit by the wood stove and sing old Appalachian ballads to her children, desperately trying to fill their empty stomachs with melodies instead of meals. To understand the ferocious, unstoppable drive of Dolly Parton, you must first understand the freezing cold of that one-room cabin. There was no electricity. There was no running water. The children slept 3 or 4 to a single bed, shivering beneath threadbare quilts stitched together from discarded flour sacks. In the dead of winter, thick layers of ice would form on the inside of the windows. "We were dirt poor," Dolly later confessed, stripping away the glamorous mythology of her success with brutal honesty. I mean, seriously poor. We didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. But the lack of food and warmth was only a fraction of the trauma. The deepest, most agonizing wound of Dolly's childhood was a profound, soul-crushing humiliation that accompanied her poverty when she was forced to step out of the mountains and into the unforgiving cruelty of the local schoolyard. Children are remarkably observant, and they can be entirely merciless. Dolly was the girl the other children whispered about. She was a girl who showed up to school wearing clothes stitched together from old rags, her shoes containing holes so large that her bare toes poked through to the freezing dirt. Perhaps the most iconic, heartbreaking illustration of this humiliation is the true story behind her legendary song, Coat of Many Colors. Her mother had lovingly sewn her a coat entirely out of small, mismatched rags given to the family. To her mother, it was a tapestry of love, echoing the biblical story of Joseph. But when young Dolly proudly wore the coat to school, the other children completely destroyed her. They laughed at her. They mocked her clothes. They locked her in a closet. They called her trash. "I knew I was poor," Dolly admitted years later, the pain of that realization still echoing in her voice. "But I didn't know I was supposed to be ashamed of it until I saw how people looked at me. I didn't know I was supposed to be ashamed of it until I saw how people looked at me." Listen to the sheer, breathtaking heartbreak of that sentence. For the older audiences watching this, especially the men and women who grew up in the shadows of the Great Depression or the harsh economic realities of the mid-20th century, who remember the exact burning shame of wearing hand-me-down clothes to school, that feeling is universally, painfully understood. When a bright, sensitive child is repeatedly told by the world that she is trash, she is faced with two choices. She can internalize the cruelty, shrink into the background, and become exactly what society expects her to be. Or she can build a psychological fortress so loud, so incredibly spectacular, and so blindingly bright that the world is forced to look at her on her own terms. Dolly chose to build a fortress, and she found the blueprint for her armor in the most unlikely, taboo inspiration imaginable. In her small, conservative mountain town, there was a woman who was universally shunned by the respectable, church-going citizens. She was a town tramp. But when young Dolly looked at this woman, she did not see a sinner. She saw an absolute goddess. This woman wore her peroxide blonde hair piled impossibly high on her head. She wore cheap, glittering jewelry, bright red lipstick, and incredibly tight clothing. The townspeople mocked her, but Dolly was absolutely mesmerized. To a little girl wearing a coat of rags, this woman looked like a queen who refused to apologize for taking up space. Dolly decided, right then and there, that this was exactly how she was going to look. For the next 60 years, the world would mock Dolly Parton's appearance. Late-night comedians would make endless, degrading jokes about her massive breasts, her towering wigs, and her heavy makeup. The media would dismiss her as a caricature, a dumb blonde who chose cheap spectacle over artistic substance. But the world completely, fundamentally misunderstood the genius of the costume. The rhinestones, the wigs, and the exaggerated femininity were never a mistake. They were a highly engineered, brilliantly calculated psychological shield. "It costs a lot of money to look this cheap," Dolly famously joked, delivering one of the most iconic, quoted lines in pop culture history. But beneath the humor was a profound, steel-reinforced boundary. Dolly created a cartoon character so that the world could laugh at the cartoon rather than laughing at the vulnerable, scarred little girl from the Smoky Mountains. The armor was impenetrable. If people were busy staring at her hair and her chest, they couldn't see the deep, lingering insecurities of her poverty. She completely weaponized the very stereotypes that were designed to diminish her. She was a brilliant, razor-sharp musical prodigy operating from inside a glittering Trojan horse. By the time she was 13, she had already performed at the legendary Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. But the agonizing reality of her home life remained entirely unchanged. There were still nights when dinner was nothing but cornbread and beans. There were still nights when she watched her exhausted, illiterate father sit at the table, his head resting heavily in his callous hands, quietly crushed by the impossible burden of feeding 12 children. Dolly lay awake in the freezing cabin, staring at the ceiling, making a quiet, absolute vow to herself. She loved her family with a fierce, unconditional devotion, but she knew that if she stayed in the mountains, she would drown in the exact same poverty that was suffocating her parents. The day after she graduated from high school in 1964, an 18-year-old Dolly Parton packed everything she owned into a battered cardboard suitcase. She hugged her weeping mother, stepped onto a Greyhound bus, and stared out the window as the Smoky Mountains faded into the distance. She was heading to Nashville, Tennessee. She had exactly $20 in her pocket, a cheap guitar on her back, and an absolute, terrified determination to make the world listen to her voice. She believed that the hardest part of her life, the freezing winters and the humiliating schoolyard mockery, was finally behind her. But the barefoot girl from the mountains was entirely unaware that the glittering, neon-lit machinery of Music City was about to subject her to a completely different kind of cruelty. The industry was waiting to chew her up and spit her out, and she was about to face a grueling, agonizing battle for the ownership of her own soul against the most powerful men in American music. The Nashville Machine, the Gilded Cage, and the King's Ultimatum. There's a cruel, almost industrialized illusion about cities built on dreams. We imagine places like Hollywood or Nashville as magical gateways where pure talent is immediately recognized and celebrated. But in the mid-1960s, Music Row in Nashville, Tennessee, was a heavily fortified, deeply cynical, male-dominated machine that devoured young dreamers and spat them out without a second thought. When 18-year-old Dolly Parton stepped off that Greyhound bus in the summer of 1964, clutching a cheap guitar and exactly $20, she believed the bleeding authenticity of her voice would force the industry to listen. She was devastatingly wrong. Her reality in Nashville was a grueling exercise in sheer survival. She moved into a cramped, roach-infested apartment. She survived the freezing nights by walking to local diners, ordering a free glass of hot water, and stirring in stolen packets of ketchup to create a miserable, watery illusion of tomato soup. She went to sleep with her stomach growling, the physical hunger a cruel echo of the mountain poverty she thought she had escaped. But the physical starvation was minor compared to professional degradation. Dolly knocked on every single door on Music Row. She walked into boardrooms run entirely by powerful older men in suits. They looked at the young girl with the impossibly high-piled hair, the heavy makeup and the tight clothes, and they did not see a musical genius. They saw a joke. They listened to her unique, high-pitched vibrato and dismissed her with a condescending smirk. One executive bluntly told the young visionary, "You're too country for country music. You're too country for country music." Listen to the breathtaking absurdity of that rejection. For the older audiences watching this, especially the women who spend decades in the workforce, fighting to be taken seriously in rooms where men judge their appearance and dismiss their intelligence, Dolly's struggle is a universally understood wound. They didn't just reject her music, they rejected her entire identity. But Dolly Parton possessed a spine forged from mountain iron. She refused to retreat. And finally, in 1967, a massive, glittering door unexpectedly swung open. Porter Wagoner was an undisputed titan of country music, famous for his rhinestone suits and his nationally syndicated television program. He was looking for a new girl singer for his show. He saw the undeniable electricity in Dolly's voice and offered her the job. It meant national television exposure and a lucrative paycheck. It was the absolute miracle she had been praying for. But she was entirely unaware that the man who had just handed her a lifeline was quietly measuring her for a set of chains. In the beginning, the partnership was magnificent. Dolly's star began to rise with terrifying speed. But behind the smiling, glittering television duets, the psychological dynamic backstage was mutating into a toxic, deeply controlling nightmare. Porter Wagoner did not just want to be Dolly's mentor. He wanted to be her master. He owned 50% of her publishing company. He dictated what songs she would sing. He aggressively kept her position in the subordinate role of his girl singer, constantly dismissing her fierce ambitions for a solo career. "He treated me like I was his property," Dolly later confessed, her voice heavy with the agonizing exhaustion of those years. "He didn't see me as an artist. He saw me as an extension of his brand. I felt like I was drowning." For 7 long years, Dolly endured this psychological tug-of-war. The girl who had weaponized her appearance to protect herself from schoolyard bullies was now trapped in a professional marriage with a man who refused to let her grow. She knew that if she stayed, her soul would eventually wither. She had to leave, but Porter refused to listen. Every time she tried to resign, he would argue and legally threaten her into staying. So, Dolly Parton did the only thing she knew how to do. She stopped arguing, picked up her acoustic guitar, and translated her absolute desperation into the only language Porter could truly understand. In the quiet, lonely hours of 1973, Dolly wrote a song. It was not a romantic ballad about a dying relationship. It was a professional resignation letter. It was an aching farewell to a man who had given her the world, but who was now demanding her soul in exchange. The next morning, she walked into Porter Wagoner's office. She strummed the guitar, and she sang the song to him for the very first time. The song was "I Will Always Love You." Bittersweet memories. That is all I'm taking with me. So goodbye, please don't cry. When she finished singing, the room fell breathlessly silent. Porter Wagoner, the tough, controlling titan of Nashville, was sitting behind his desk with tears streaming down his face. That is the prettiest song I ever heard. Porter wept, and you can go, providing I get to produce that record. Dolly had literally sung her way out of captivity. She had purchased her own freedom with a melody. She left the show in 1974, launching her highly anticipated solo career. "I Will Always Love You" skyrocketed to #1 on the Billboard charts. Dolly was no longer a sidekick. She was a superstar. But the universe, testing the absolute limits of her newfound independence, was about to deliver a monumental, terrifying temptation. As the song dominated the radio, Dolly received a phone call that would make any songwriter on Earth collapse in pure euphoria. Colonel Tom Parker, the notoriously ruthless manager of Elvis Presley, called to inform her that the king himself wanted to record a cover of "I Will Always Love You." Dolly was absolutely ecstatic. Having Elvis Presley sing her song was the ultimate, unimaginably lucrative validation. But the night before the recording session, Colonel Parker called her back. He informed Dolly that it was Elvis's strict policy that the original songwriter must surrender exactly 50% of the publishing rights to him. Stop and consider the sheer, terrifying gravity of this ultimatum. This is a woman who grew up with nothing, a woman who had just fought a brutal 7-year war to escape the financial control of one powerful man. And now, the most famous entertainer in the history of human civilization was offering her millions of dollars and global immortality. All she had to do was sign away half of her own creation. Almost every single songwriter in Nashville would have signed the paper without a second thought. But Dolly looked at the most powerful management team in the world, and she made a decision of absolute, breathtaking bravery. She said no. "I said, I'm really sorry, but I can't give you the publishing," Dolly later recalled, describing the agonizing aftermath of that phone call. "I cried all night. I mean, it was Elvis. I loved Elvis. But that was my stuff. I had to keep the copyright for my family. I cried all night, but that was my stuff." Listen to the majestic, awe-inspiring integrity of that refusal. For every person who has ever been bullied by a corporation or pressured to compromise their life's work just to sit at the table with the powerful elites, Dolly's no is an absolute triumph of the human spirit. She walked away from the king of rock and roll to protect the kingdom she had built for herself. And the universe eventually proved her brilliantly, astonishingly right. Nearly 2 decades later, in 1992, an R&B superstar named Whitney Houston recorded a cover of "I Will Always Love You" for the cinematic blockbuster The Bodyguard. Because Dolly Parton had endured a night of tears in 1974 and refused to surrender her publishing rights, that single cover by Whitney Houston would earn Dolly an estimated $10 million in pure royalties. The barefoot girl from the Smoky Mountains had completely outsmarted the entire music industry. She had proven that beneath the towering blonde wigs and heavy makeup was a ruthless, brilliant, and entirely uncompromising business mogul. But as the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the dizzying ascent of Dolly Parton's empire was about to demand a terrifying personal toll. She had successfully conquered the men who tried to control her career, but she was intensely guarding a profound, mysterious secret regarding the man she had quietly chosen to marry. And beyond the shadow of her hidden husband, an invisible, deeply agonizing medical storm was silently gathering inside her own body, a crisis that would cruelly, permanently destroy her deepest biological dream. The invisible husband, the asphalt pacer, and the ultimate sanctuary. There's a highly destructive, almost radioactive quality to massive global fame. When an artist achieves a level of absolute, suffocating omnipresence that Dolly Parton commanded by the late 1970s, the spotlight does not merely illuminate their life. It incinerates it. In the ruthless machinery of the entertainment industry, marriages are routinely fed into the furnace of public relations. Relationships are broadcasted, dissected by tabloids, and inevitably, tragically crushed under the unbearable weight of a million staring eyes. But Dolly Parton, the woman who appeared to offer every single inch of her glittering, spectacular self to the public, was secretly executing the most brilliant, fiercely protective act of psychological warfare in the history of modern celebrity. She gave the world the Rhinestones. She gave the world the towering wigs, the infectious laugh, and the iconic, exaggerated curves. But there was one solitary piece of her existence that she absolutely, unconditionally refused to place on the altar of Hollywood. She hid her husband. To understand the profound, breathtaking beauty of this 60-year marriage, we must go all the way back to the very first day an 18-year-old Dolly stepped off that Greyhound bus in Nashville in May of 1964. She was carrying her cardboard suitcase and her cheap guitar. On her very first afternoon in the city, she was washing her clothes at a local wishy-washy laundromat. A young, incredibly handsome 21-year-old man drove by in a white Chevy pickup truck. He stopped, walked over to the young girl with the sunburned shoulders, and warned her that she was going to get bad burn if she stayed out in the sun. His name was Carl Thomas Dean. He was not a music executive. He was not an actor, and he had absolutely no interest in the glittering, frantic ambitions of Music Row. He was a quiet, grounded, and intensely private young man who ran an asphalt paving business. He worked with his hands. He smelled of hot tar, gravel, and honest, exhausting blue-collar labor. In a city swarming with opportunistic men who were eager to exploit, manipulate, or profit off young, naive female singers, Carl offered something radically, beautifully different: absolute safety. He didn't want a percentage of her future royalties. He just wanted to buy her a meal and make sure she was okay. From the exact moment their eyes met, an unbreakable, magnetic anchor was dropped into the earth. Carl looked at the girl with the big dreams and the big hair, and he simply saw a woman he wanted to come home to. 2 years later, in May of 1966, the incredibly cynical machinery of the music industry attempted to interfere. Dolly's record label, Monument Records, explicitly ordered her not to get married. The executives callously informed her that a husband would ruin her marketability. They told her that the public wanted an available, single girl, not a married woman. But Dolly Parton does not take orders from men in suits. Refusing to let the industry dictate her heart, Dolly and Carl quietly drove across the state line to a small, unassuming Baptist church in Ringgold, Georgia. They were married in absolute secrecy, with only her mother, the preacher, and his wife in attendance. There was no press. There were no flashing cameras. There were no designer gowns, no diamond rings sponsored by luxury brands, and no public relations strategies. It was just a barefoot girl from the mountains and a hard-working man in a simple suit, making a sacred, unbreakable promise before God. It was a fiercely guarded patch of normal life. It was the first and last time the music industry would ever attempt to touch her marriage. As the decades rolled on, the stark visual contrast between Dolly Parton and Carl Dean became almost mythological. Dolly became the most recognizable, highly photographed woman on the face of the planet. She was performing in sold-out arenas, starring in blockbuster films, and building a multi-million-dollar theme park. But Carl Dean essentially became a ghost. In over 60 years of marriage, Carl has been photographed with Dolly only a handful of times. He completely refused to walk the red carpets. He never attended the Grammy Awards. In fact, early in her career, Carl attended exactly one industry dinner with Dolly. He sat through the chaotic, superficial noise of the evening, drove her home, and looked at his wife with absolute clarity. He looked at me and said, "Dolly, I want you to have everything you want, and I'm happy for you, but don't you ever ask me to go to another one of them dang things again," Dolly recalled, her voice filled with a deep, affectionate laughter. And she never did. Think about the sheer, majestic respect of that boundary. For the older audiences watching this, for the men and women who have been married for decades and understand that the secret to eternal love is not trying to force your partner to become someone they are not, Dolly and Carl are the ultimate, undisputed masterpiece of mature relationship. Dolly did not try to change the asphalt paver into a Hollywood socialite. And Carl never, ever tried to clip the wings of the most spectacular, soaring butterfly in the world. He understood with profound, quiet wisdom that the glittering icon on the stadium stage belonged to the millions of fans, but the tired, soft-spoken woman who walked the front door at midnight belonged entirely to him. In an era where male egos were easily shattered by a successful, wealthy woman, Carl's steadfast, unshakable confidence in his own masculinity was its own kind of quiet superpower. Instead of fighting the fame, they built a wall. When you look at Dolly Parton's massive, wildly exaggerated public persona, you are actually looking at a highly sophisticated diversion tactic. She was the loudest, brightest lightning rod in the universe. She deliberately drew all the attention, all the paparazzi, and all the noise directly toward herself, so that her husband could remain entirely undisturbed in the quiet shadows of their Tennessee farm. Fame was her battlefield, but Carl was her sanctuary. Imagine the incredibly beautiful, cinematic reality of their evenings together. The woman who spent 14 hours a day trapped inside heavy, towering wigs, corsets, and 6-inch heels, stepping onto her private tour bus, driving back to their quiet farm in Nashville. She walks to the front door, takes off the wig, washes off the heavy stage makeup, and puts on a pair of comfortable sweatpants. The roaring crowds of 20,000 screaming fans are entirely gone. The only sound is the quiet hum of the Tennessee crickets. She sits at the kitchen table across from a man who does not care about her Billboard chart history, a man who has loved her since she was a starving teenager outside a laundromat. "He is my rock," Dolly once said softly, her voice stripping away every ounce of the cartoonish glitz, revealing the deep, grounded woman beneath. "He's the only person in the world who doesn't want a piece of me. He just wants me. He's the only person in the world who doesn't want a piece of me." Listen to the breathtaking, quiet relief in that sentence. When you are the primary provider for an enormous extended family, the CEO of a vast entertainment corporation, and the spiritual anchor for millions of fans, the entire world is constantly draining your energy. Carl was the only oasis where she was allowed to be empty. He was the only person who replenished her soul. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the barefoot girl from the mountains had successfully built a perfect, impenetrable fortress. She had her millions. She had her absolute artistic freedom. And she had the quiet, enduring love of a man who provided her ultimate safety. They had everything. And there was only one final, beautiful piece missing from their perfect sanctuary. They wanted a child. They had even picked out names for the babies they desperately hoped to welcome into their quiet farmhouse. Dolly, the woman who had helped raise her 11 younger brothers and sisters, possessed an infinite, deep well of maternal love, and she was finally ready to pour it into a child of her own. But the universe, operating with an incredibly cruel, unpredictable, and devastating sense of irony, was quietly preparing to deliver a catastrophic blow. The woman who had fought so hard to control her own destiny was entirely unaware that an invisible, agonizing medical storm was silently ravaging her own body. The brilliant, neon-lit sky of her career was about to go pitch black. And the invincible queen of country music was about to be dragged into a valley of physical and psychological darkness, so incredibly profound, so utterly suffocating, that she would find herself staring into an absolute, terrifying abyss, desperately wondering if the pain was simply too heavy to survive. The empty cradle, the invisible abyss, and the angel with paws. There's a profound, beautifully simple expectation that is deeply woven into the fabric of a woman raised in the Appalachian Mountains. In a one-room cabin where 12 children slept shoulder to shoulder, Dolly Parton learned early on that a house is not a home until it's filled with the chaotic, deafening, and glorious noise of children. Family was the absolute, undeniable center of gravity in her universe. By the time the early 1980s arrived, Dolly had successfully conquered the entire entertainment industry. She had crossed over into pop music. She had conquered Hollywood, starring in the cultural phenomenon 9/5. She was a globally recognized multimillionaire mogul running her own production company. She had built a magnificent, unassailable kingdom, and she and her fiercely devoted husband, Carl, were finally ready to fill the echoing, quiet halls of that kingdom with the one thing they wanted more than anything else in the world. They wanted to be parents. They had even picked out the names of the children they desperately dreamed of welcoming. But the universe, operating with an incomprehensible, terrifying cruelty, does not care about the size of a woman's empire. Biology is an absolute, uncompromising dictator. Behind the glittering rhinestones, the towering blonde wigs, and the relentless, grueling schedule of a global superstar, an invisible, agonizing medical storm was silently ravaging Dolly's body. For years, she had been battling severe, excruciating physical pain, pushing through concert after concert on sheer, blinding adrenaline, terrified that if she stopped working, her entire world would collapse. But the human body eventually demands a reckoning. Dolly was diagnosed with a severe, debilitating case of endometriosis. Internal bleeding and profound, unrelenting physical agony forced the unstoppable queen of country music to completely halt her life. She was rushed to the hospital, where her doctors delivered a verdict that permanently, violently severed the timeline of her existence. To save her life, the doctors had to perform a partial hysterectomy. When Dolly woke up in the sterile, fluorescent-lit recovery room, the physical pain of the surgery was entirely eclipsed by a psychological devastation so complete, so absolutely annihilating, that it defies human language. The doctors gently, professionally informed the 30-something-year-old woman that the surgery was successful, but the consequence was irreversible. She would never, ever be able to have children of her own. To fully comprehend the staggering, suffocating weight of this reality, you must look past the icon and look purely at the woman. Imagine being a girl who helped raise 11 brothers and sisters. Imagine spending decades working yourself to bone to secure a safe, beautiful home, picking out names for your unborn babies with the love of your life, only to be told that the nursery of your imagination must be permanently boarded up. The universe had granted her millions of adoring fans, but had brutally, permanently locked the door to motherhood. For the audiences watching this, especially the women who have endured the quiet, intensely private agony of infertility, who have smiled through the tears at baby showers while carrying a heavy, invisible graveyard of their own shattered dreams in their chests, Dolly's grief strikes an incredibly raw, bleeding nerve. It is a sorrow that hollows out the soul. Following the surgery, Dolly Parton plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The woman who was famous for her infectious, room-brightening laugh fell into a severe, paralyzing depression. The relentless pressure of her career, the exhaustion of maintaining her public persona, and the crushing, unbearable realization of her empty cradle collided into a perfect, catastrophic psychological storm. She was living in a paradoxical hell. She was successful by every conceivable metric of modern society. But inside, she felt utterly, completely worthless. She was a woman drowning in plain sight. She would put on the wigs, paint on the heavy makeup, step onto a brightly lit stage and sing her heart out, and then return to her dressing room and completely collapse in tears. I was at my lowest. Dolly later confessed in a rare, profoundly vulnerable admission that stripped away decades of the cheerful cartoon character. I was successful by every measure, but inside I felt empty. I couldn't see a way forward. The depression tightened its grip, pulling her deeper and deeper into a valley where the light of her faith seemed entirely extinguished. It culminated on one particularly dark, agonizing afternoon. Dolly was sitting entirely alone in a room, completely consumed by the unbearable heaviness of her own existence. The pain had become a physical, crushing weight on her chest. She was staring into the absolute abyss, feeling the very last, flickering embers of her will to live quietly evaporating into the shadows. She was standing on the absolute edge of surrender, convinced that the world would simply be better off without the exhausted, broken woman behind the Rhinestones. But just as the darkness prepared to swallow her whole, the universe deployed a miracle. It did not send a doctor. It did not send a Hollywood executive. It sent a tiny, unassuming angel with paws. At the exact, terrifying moment when Dolly's spirit was on the verge of breaking completely, her beloved pet dog, a little companion named Popeye, came bounding into the room. Popeye didn't know about the Billboard charts. He didn't know about the hysterectomy, and he didn't care about the empty nursery. He simply ran up to the weeping, devastated superstar, wagging his tail, looking up at her with eyes full of absolute, pure, and unconditional love. When Dolly looked down into the innocent eyes of that little dog, something incredibly profound, almost divine, violently snapped inside her brain. That dog looked at me like I was the whole world, Dolly later recalled, her voice thick with the memory of that fragile, life-saving moment of grace. And I realized who would take care of him, who would miss me, and I knew I couldn't give up. That dog looked at me like I was the whole world. Listen to the majestic, breathtaking mercy of that realization. For anyone who has ever stared into the dark, contemplating the unbearable weight of their own pain, it is often the smallest, most innocent things that tether us back to the earth. A dog's wet nose against a hand, the sound of a bird outside a window, the quiet realization that even when you feel entirely worthless, you are still absolutely essential to someone or something that loves you. Popeye broke the trance. He was the anchor that stopped her from falling over the edge. Dolly felt the floor, wrapping her arms around the dog, weeping not from despair, but from the sudden, overwhelming rush of survival. It was a turning point. She realized that she needed help. She sought therapy. She leaned heavily into her faith, her music, and quiet, immovable, rock-solid support of her husband, Carl, who simply held her through the darkest nights without ever demanding that she fix herself. Dolly slowly, painstakingly began to rebuild her shattered soul from the inside out. But she emerged from that dark valley with a completely altered philosophy on human suffering. I learned that it's okay not to be okay, Dolly said years later, delivering a quote of such profound, healing wisdom that it serves as a beacon of light for millions. I learned that you can be strong and still break, and that breaking doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're human. She had accepted her brokenness. She had made peace with the empty cradle. But as she wiped her tears and looked out at the world with a newly repaired, immensely empathetic heart, the queen of country music made a quiet, spectacular vow to the universe. If biology would not allow her to be a mother to her own children, she was not going to let that maternal love rot inside her chest. She was going to take the massive, overflowing, unspent ocean of a mother's love, and she was going to unleash it upon the entire planet. The woman who was told she could never have a child was about to step out of the shadows and completely, permanently transform herself into the most beloved, fiercely generous mother to hundreds of millions of children around the globe. The greatest, most awe-inspiring alchemy of her entire life was about to begin. The alchemy of grief, the illiterate patriarch, and the mother of millions. There's an ancient, almost mystical concept known as alchemy, the legendary process of transforming raw, heavy lead into pure, shining gold, in the brutal, unpredictable reality of human existence. True alchemy does not happen in a laboratory. It happens inside a broken heart. It is the incredibly rare, majestic ability to take the crushing, heavy lead of your own personal tragedy and deliberately transform it into a golden light that warms the rest of the world. By the 1990s, Dolly Parton had survived the darkest, most terrifying valley of her psychological collapse. The medical storm that had permanently stripped her the ability to bear children had left a massive, echoing void in her chest. But as she emerged from the shadows, firmly anchored by the unwavering, quiet love of her husband, Carl, Dolly made a decision of absolute, breathtaking defiance. She refused to let the immense, overflowing reservoir of maternal love sour into bitterness. If the universe would not allow her to rock a cradle in her own home, she was going to build a cradle large enough to hold the entire world. She was going to become the mother of millions. But to orchestrate the greatest, most impactful philanthropic legacy in the history of American entertainment, Dolly did not look toward the future. She looked backward. She looked all the way back to the freezing dirt floor cabin in the Smoky Mountains, and she looked directly at the calloused, exhausted hands of her father. Robert Lee Parton was a brilliant, hard-working man. He was a fierce, deeply proud patriarch of 12 children. He could fix anything, grow anything, and negotiate complex trades to keep his family from starving. But Robert Lee carried a quiet, agonizing shame that haunted him his entire life. He was completely illiterate. He could neither read nor write. For a man who could navigate the treacherous seasons of the mountains, who could build a life and provide for 12 children with his bare hands, being defeated by a simple piece of printed paper was a quiet, daily humiliation. He possessed a profound, earthly wisdom, but society often judged him by a metric he was never given the chance to master. For the older audiences watching this, especially those who remember the harsh, unforgiving realities of the mid-20th century working class, where intelligent, capable men and women were denied basic education simply because they had to work the fields to survive, Robert Lee's silent shame is profoundly, deeply understood. Dolly watched her incredibly smart father lower his head in humiliation when he had to sign official documents with an X. She knew that his inability to read felt like a heavy, invisible chain around his neck. In 1995, Dolly decided it was time to break that chain for the next generation. She launched the Imagination Library. The concept was incredibly simple, yet breathtakingly profound in its execution. Dolly promised to mail one high-quality, age-appropriate book every single month directly to the home of any child, from the day they were born until they turned 5 years old, completely free of charge, no strings attached. No catch. She started the program locally in her home county of Sevier, Tennessee, specifically so her father could be involved. She wanted a man who couldn't read to help her give the gift of reading to thousands of children. Imagine the sheer magic of that process for a struggling family. A young child runs the mailbox and finds a package with their own name on it. Inside is a brand new, colorful book. For many of these children, it was the very first book they had ever owned. Dolly didn't just give them reading material. She gave them the radical, life-altering belief that they were worthy of receiving a beautiful gift. Reflecting on the profound, tear-inducing climax of this father-daughter endeavor, Dolly delivered a quote that strips away every ounce of her celebrity, revealing the pure, devoted mountain girl beneath. My daddy couldn't read and write, and that was a crippling thing to him, Dolly shared, her voice trembling with an exquisite, overwhelming love. He was the smartest man I have ever known. Before he passed away, he told me he was more proud of the Imagination Library than anything else I had ever done. When the kids called me the book lady, my daddy was so proud. That meant more to me than any record I ever sold. When the kids called me the book lady, my daddy was so proud. Listen to the absolute, majestic beauty of that healing. The woman who was told she could never be a mother was suddenly receiving mail from thousands of children who viewed her as their fairy godmother. And the father who was ashamed of his illiteracy lived long enough to see his daughter conquer the very darkness that had plagued him. But the Imagination Library did not stay local. It exploded into a staggering global phenomenon. Today, It operates in 5 countries. It has mailed out an absolutely incomprehensible, mind-bending 200 million free books to children around the world. That is not a typo. 200 million. She took the agonizing tears she shed over her empty cradle, and she transformed them into 200 million moments of joy for children she will never even meet. But her maternal, fiercely protective instinct was not limited to books. When her people were in danger, the mother of the Smoky Mountains transformed into a relentless, unstoppable shield. In 2016, catastrophic, highly destructive wildfires swept violently through the Great Smoky Mountains, incinerating homes, destroying livelihoods, and displacing thousands of terrified families in her home region of East Tennessee. These were not anonymous strangers on a news broadcast. These were the very mountains that had echoed with her childhood songs. The ashes falling from the sky were the remains of the tight-knit, proud communities that had raised her, the people who would cheer for her before she ever saw a Hollywood red carpet. While politicians argued over budgets and bureaucratic red tape strangled the relief efforts, Dolly did not issue a polite, sanitized public relations statement. She went to work. She immediately launched the My People Fund. She bypassed the slow, exhausting machinery of traditional charities and announced that she would give $1,000 a month in direct, tax-free cash for 6 consecutive months to every single family who had lost their primary residence in the fires. No lengthy applications. No humiliating hoops to jump through. If your home burned down, Dolly handed you the money to survive. Over $12 million was directly injected into the hands of the working-class people who had lost everything. "These are my people," Dolly said simply, brushing off the immense praise of the media. "And when your people are hurting, you show up." This is the very essence of her unbelievable, bulletproof legacy. She does not hoard her wealth behind guarded gates. She does not build monuments to her own ego. She uses her multi-million-dollar empire as a massive, rapid-response rescue boat for anyone who is drowning. In an era where celebrity philanthropy is too often defined by lavish, self-congratulatory galas and endless administrative delays, Dolly's approach remains breathtakingly blue-collar. She treats a humanitarian crisis with the exact same practical, no-nonsense urgency that she learned on a dirt farm in Locust Ridge. And she proved this once again on an unprecedented, global scale. In 2020, as a terrifying, invisible pandemic forced the entire planet into a paralyzed, suffocating lockdown, the scientific community was frantically racing against the clock to develop a vaccine. Dolly Parton quietly, without a single press conference or a flashy social media announcement, donated a staggering $1 million to the Vanderbilt University Medical Center. That specific, massive injection of capital directly helped fund the critical, early-stage research that ultimately led to the development of the Moderna vaccine, a scientific breakthrough that saved millions of lives across the globe. When the world eventually discovered her massive contribution, the media tried to crown her as a savior. But Dolly, staying entirely true to the humble, grounded roots of her one-room cabin, immediately deflected the worship. "I'm no hero," she insisted with her trademark, self-deprecating warmth. "I just did what anybody with the means would do. I'm just a girl who got lucky, and I want to share the luck." She had completely transcended the very concept of fame. The girl who was bullied for wearing a coat of rags had become the undisputed, universally beloved matriarch of American generosity. She had crossed political lines, generational divides, and cultural boundaries. But as the calendar pages flipped rapidly toward the mid-2020s, the queen of country music was approaching a monumental milestone. The relentless, exhausting, and magnificent journey was bringing her to her 80th birthday. The world wondered the vibrant, rhinestone-studded icon would finally put down the guitar, take off the towering wigs, and quietly retreat into the shadows. But they completely underestimated the absolute, unbreakable joy of Dolly Parton. The ultimate survivor was preparing to show the world exactly how a legend ages, proving once and for all that the armor she built in the mountains was never meant to hide her. It was meant to ensure she shined forever. The Rhinestone Saint, the Diamond Anniversary, and the Ultimate Legacy. There's an unspoken, incredibly persistent, and often cruel demand that society places upon aging women, particularly those who have spent their entire lives in the blazing, unforgiving spotlight of the entertainment industry. We expect them to eventually surrender to the exhaustion of time. We want them to politely wipe off the heavy makeup, take off the glamorous, glittering costumes, and quietly fade into the soft, muted background of traditional grandmotherhood. The world demands that women of a certain era finally act their age, becoming invisible as the calendar turns. But Dolly Parton has never, ever cared about what the cynical world expects her to do. Today, in the spring of 2026, Dolly Parton has officially crossed the magnificent, monumental threshold of her 80th birthday. For a woman who has endured crushing, freezing poverty, the ruthless betrayal of the male-dominated music industry, the silent agony of losing her ability to bear children, and the grueling, physical toll of 6 decades of constant touring, 80 years old is not merely a number. It is an absolute, undeniable victory lap. And true to her fiercely independent, unapologetic mountain spirit, she has absolutely no intention of fading into the background. The towering, peroxide blonde wigs remain perfectly, immaculately styled. The acrylic nails are still flawlessly painted. The glittering, rhinestone-encrusted outfits still reflect the light with the exact same blinding, joyous intensity they did in the 1970s. When asked by journalists if she would ever consider retiring her legendary, artificial look to embrace a more natural twilight, Dolly offered a response of such brilliant, self-aware perfection that it permanently shut down the critics. "I'll never retire, and I'll never take off the makeup," Dolly declared, her signature laugh echoing with the absolute confidence of a queen who completely owns her kingdom. "I don't have time to get old. I'll just look like a cartoon character forever. It costs a lot of money to look this cheap, but I know who I am underneath it all. My heart is pure gold. I know who I am underneath it all." Listen to the absolute majestic liberation in that sentence. For the older audiences watching this, especially for the men and women who have spent decades being judged by their physical appearance, their social class, or their geographical backgrounds, Dolly's refusal to change is a breathtaking act of rebellion. She proved the ultimate, beautiful paradox of her existence. She is the most artificial-looking woman in the history of American entertainment, yet she possesses the most genuine, uncorrupted, and authentically pure soul on the entire planet. She wore the Rhinestones initially as a shield to protect the barefoot, hungry little girl from the Smoky Mountains, but eventually, she forged that shield into an indestructible crown. But the true, enduring magic of Dolly Parton in the year 2026 is not found on a massive concert stage, nor is it found in the sterile boardrooms of her multi-billion-dollar empire. It is found at the end of a quiet, winding dirt road in Brentwood, Tennessee. In May of 2026, Dolly and her fiercely private, invisible husband, Carl Thomas Dean, are celebrating a milestone that is almost mathematically impossible in the modern entertainment industry. They are celebrating their diamond anniversary, 60 unbroken years of marriage. Think about the sheer, staggering magnitude of 60 years. They have outlasted every single musical trend, every ruthless studio executive, and almost every other celebrity marriage of their generation. To fully appreciate this miracle, you must look at the man standing in the shadows. In the 1960s and 70s, it took an incredibly rare, profoundly secure type of man to step aside and let his wife become the most famous, desired woman in the world. Carl Dean never felt emasculated by Dolly's towering success. He spent his entire life successfully dodging the paparazzi, absolutely refusing to walk the red carpets, and quietly running his humble asphalt paving business, while his wife conquered the globe. He never demanded a piece of her fame, and she never demanded that he sacrifice his peace to feed her ego. Imagine the incredibly beautiful, cinematic reality of their mornings today. The 80-year-old global icon, the woman who donated millions to save the world during a global pandemic and mailed 200 million books to impoverished children, wakes up early in her quiet Tennessee farmhouse. She doesn't have a team of chefs. She makes a simple Southern breakfast for a man who pulled his pickup truck over to talk to her outside a sweltering laundromat back in 1964. They do not celebrate their billions. They take their old RV, drive out to a quiet, secluded spot by the river, and eat a simple picnic lunch off paper plates, drinking sweet tea in absolute, unbreakable silence. He is still her rock. She is still his girl. They build a massive, invisible wall around their love. And for 60 years, they never let a single drop of Hollywood poison seep through the cracks. Fame was a battlefield where she fought for her family, but Carl was the sanctuary where she came to rest. When we step back and look at the absolute totality of Dolly Parton's 80 years on Earth, the poetic symmetry of her journey is almost overwhelming. She was a girl born in a freezing one-room cabin with dirt floors, surrounded by the terrifying, suffocating grip of systemic poverty. But she did not let the dirt define her. She took the agonizing insults of the schoolyard bullies who called her trash, the ruthless control of powerful men who tried to own her voice, and the heartbreaking, devastating medical news of her empty cradle. And she threw every single piece of that agony into a blazing furnace of sheer willpower. What came out of that furnace was a woman who simply refused to let the world remain cold. If she could not have children of her own, she was not going to let her maternal instincts rot into bitterness. She was going to become the benevolent, fiercely generous mother to hundreds of millions of children across the globe. If her father had to suffer the quiet, degrading shame of illiteracy his entire life, she was going to ensure that every child she could possibly reach would know the magical, liberating feeling of holding a book in their hands. She healed her father's deepest wound by becoming the book lady to the world. In a modern era that is increasingly fractured by political division, anger, and profound cultural isolation, Dolly Parton has achieved something genuinely miraculous. She is the only thing that all of America can agree upon. She bridges the gap between conservative South and the liberal coasts. She doesn't preach. She doesn't judge. She simply loves. She transcended country music. She transcended pop culture. She became a living, breathing saint. Long after the Rhinestones eventually lose their sparkle, and long after the towering blonde wigs are retired to museum display cases, the true legacy of Dolly Parton will remain entirely bulletproof. Her legacy is not written on the Billboard charts, and it is not measured by the size of her bank accounts. It is written in the minds of the children who learned to read because she cared enough to send them a book. It is written in the newly restored homes of the families she saved from the devastating Tennessee wildfires. And it is written in the hearts of every single person who ever felt too poor, too different, or too broken, who looked at Dolly and learned that it is okay to be exactly who you are as long as you are kind. The barefoot girl from Locust Ridge took a Greyhound bus to Nashville with $20 and a pocket full of impossible dreams. She bought the entire town, saved the world, and still managed to make it home in time for dinner with the only man she ever loved. The song is over, but the melody of her magnificent golden heart will absolutely outlast us all. As Dolly's beautiful journey reminds us, true wealth isn't what we keep, but what we willingly give away. She proved that even a broken heart can still find the strength to mother the world. What about you? How have you turned your own deep losses or disappointments into a legacy of love for your family or community? Please share your hard-earned wisdom in the comments below. If this Rhinestone saint inspired you, please leave a like, share this video, and subscribe for more untold stories behind the legends. Remember, kindness is the greatest currency. Until next time, keep shining.